Hello, everyone. Welcome to Keen on Yoga. So this is our second podcast episode with Christopher Wallis, otherwise known as Hareesh, his spiritual name. And enjoyed the first one so much that he mentioned he had this book out, and he sent me a copy very kindly, pre to its publication, to its release, and I've read it. And so today we're going to talk about his new book, Near Enemies of the Truth, and anything else that kind of comes up. So we won't be too scripted. I just want to say I totally recommend it, and I mean that. It's a really, really good book. Near Enemies of the Truth is about spiritual cliches and how they're very similar, or there's something in them, but they're also very deceptive as well, and can stand for going down a bit of a cul-de-sac. But like anything, there's a bit of truth in everything. So without further delay, let me say thank you again, Christopher, for coming on, Hareesh, and looking forward to this.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the book is it's a much needed book that needed to be written, because we're hearing these cliches all the time. I'm just going through the book, and I've read it a couple of times over, really, because I thought it was excellent, because they're annoying. The spiritual cliche is quite annoying to hear for many people, I'm sure, from the sounds of the book. Also, to Christopher's perspective, can be annoying. People are saying things like, be your best self, speak your truth, be in the moment, listen to your heart. There's so many of them, right? You can think of many off the cuff, I'm sure, if you're listening along. And there's something to them. But on the other hand, they're very deceptive, and they stand for a lack of real critical thinking, or just thinking things through and connecting more deeply. So, yeah, we're going to go through a few of those today and just see where we go. But first of all, Christopher, I know you've given the book to a number of people. How has it been received so far? Because, just to quote the introduction, you say, the only way everyone's point of view can be equally valid is when there's no such thing as truth, and thus relativism always masks implicit nihilism, the view that there's no fundamental truths. And so nihilism tends to make human beings very cynical and deeply dissatisfied. So, this is already discordant from what many people will think
Mm.
today, that anyone's truth is their truth, right? And now you're saying, from the very get go, really, that there's one objective reality here, it seems. What would you? How would you diffuse this situation? I think many people say, well, I believe whatever I want. So about reality, isn't my opinion equally as valid as Christopher's opinion?
Yes, well, this is a thorny issue to wade into, but very much worth it. Um, I'm not actually saying there's one objective reality. I'm saying that thoughts or narratives, mental constructs, can never be true, but they can approach the truth more or less closely. And so we should evaluate formulations of thought in terms of how close they come to the truth, while admitting they can never actually capture truth, because truth by its very nature is non-conceptual, it's non-verbal. And yet we must make this effort to try to get close to the truth with our words. And so it's not the case that all points of view are equally valid, because some approximate truth much better than others. And we can measure this in various ways, but my favorite measure is efficacy, meaning to say that a formulation approaches the truth more closely when it can be shown to be effective. That is to say, when it's sufficiently in accord with reality that it allows us to make predictions that are then proved valid. It allows us to explain um, something that's happened in a way that provides utility. That is to say, that gives us actual leverage so that we can do something useful on the basis of that narrative. So, any formulation about reality is a narrative, but some narratives are more aligned with reality. And we see that in the way that they give us this leverage, allow us to do something
Mm,
useful,
mm,
like connect with each other more
mm.
effectively, and so on.
Wow. That was a tough, a tough beginning I gave you, actually. But it is. I suppose it resonated with me because I'm often on social media, and as you know, it's a tough and thorny place, and people. often giving their own narratives, which might be different to my own, and then really these days, you feel like you can't say anything to anyone. And you mentioned later in the book also this idea of gaslighting, and how it's so easy to say, well, your experience is then not true, therefore not really your experience either. And this is coming to the speaking the truth point in the chapter. You say, if we can speak in actual inarguables, authentically undeniable truths, we rapidly get to the heart of the matter and have a productive conversation. Yeah? So I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about that. I know it's a little bit of a tangential question, but I mean, how to have a productive argument or discussion with people, especially on things like social media, when it's so easy to just throw the word around, throw the term gaslighting around. Yet, on the other hand, as you admit yourself, we've all done it.
Hmm.
We all have denied that other people are having the experience they're having.
Yeah. So there's several levels to look at here. Um, First of all, it is indeed possible that somebody could misunderstand their own experience and therefore misrepresent it. But let's set that aside for now. Let's just give the benefit of the doubt that they're representing their own experience accurately, more or less. But still, what almost everyone does, especially on social media, is they extrapolate from their experience to a general truth or a general
Mm-hmm.
proposition. And they imagine that what has been true in their experience is applicable much more across the board than it really is. And then they end up sort of weaponizing their truth, usually unintentionally, right? And they try to tell people how it is and how they're wrong on the but they don't actually take responsibility. They don't say, well, this is my experience and I have no idea if it can be extrapolated to a broader context. They just assume that it can. So that itself is already problematic. And then if we rewind to look at this even deeper issue, why is somebody representing their experience the way that they are? It's usually not just a factual description of their experience, it's an interpretation. And the interpretation is skewed in various ways by their past history, their assumptions, their opinions, their unresolved experiences, the shadow elements of their psyche, and so on and so on and so on. So it gets actually quite difficult to ascertain where truth lies. And I try to clarify it in that chapter by saying, well, you're on the firmest possible ground when you start from the true inarguables. And the true inarguables are, on the one hand, I talk about objective inarguables. That's what everyone can agree on. Uh, Everyone can look and see, oh, yes, that's the case, right?
Mm,
And
mm.
subjective inarguables have to do with what you are viscerally feeling, not your interpretation, but what you're actually feeling. So, this there could be countless examples, right? But
Yeah, maybe the argument of the kitchen is a good one. Maybe mention
yeah,
that coming
yeah,
into a
because it's
dirty
very
kitchen. That was
simple. It's a very simple
yeah,
thing that many people have experienced because we have
yes,
housemates or roommates and we don't have the same behavior patterns as them. So I give the example of, like, you come into the kitchen in the morning and it's a big mess, and our usual go to is to just judge the person and say, oh, what a slob or whatever. But if we want to have a productive conversation, we need to base it on inarguables. So, for example, when I came into the kitchen this morning and I saw the sink full of dirty dishes, right? Everyone can agree the sink is full of dirty dishes. So it's an inarguable. I felt, and then the subjective inarguable, whatever you actually felt, I felt my heart sink, or I felt deflated or defeated or whatever. Whatever's actually true for you, but expressed in terms of the bodily experience, that's the inarguable, as opposed to something like that's very much arguable, like I felt disrespected
yeah,
by your, so then they can immediately start arguing that. But the person is more likely to keep listening when instead of an accusation, you've just stated these inarguables, and of course, some people are not going to be open to listening no matter how you express yourself. But it's really about how we can heal and deepen human relationships by sticking to the most basic, the most visceral truths, instead of arguing for our interpretations of our experience, because already interpretation is getting further and further away
Mm,
from the base truth of the
mm,
experience.
mm,
And
mm.
then you just keep doing that, because whatever response the person gives you, let's say, even though you've spoken in this non-accusatory way, let's say they get defensive anyway, then you would respond to that with your inarguable truth. It's like, oh, when I hear you respond that way, I feel frustrated. Well, and
And
it
they'll
can
say,
go on.
"How have you just spent an hour with some kind of psychiatrist?" They'll say back to
Yes,
you, "Yeah,
yes. Well, that
you've been
indeed is
listening to those podcasts again, haven't you?"
That's
Yeah,
that indeed is the problem, is that
yeah.
if you change your way of speaking sort of too quickly or too dramatically, people are immediately like, wait, what's going on? you know, so you might actually need to say, what you're doing. Hey, I'm trying to speak in terms of actual truth
Mm,
as near as I can discern it, instead of judgments or blame or something like that. So could you please support me in that, because I want to speak in a more productive and a more respectful or caring way. That's one thing that we can do, is sort of make that meta comment so that people understand what's going on. And of course, when we try to change the way we're speaking, we're going to stumble at first. But what's really important, actually, is not just changing the words you're using. What's really important is changing your actual perspective. And so that involves, which I mentioned in the book, realizing that everyone has the right to be as they are and to behave as they do. And so your judgment of their behavior is really neither here nor there, right? Because we're all harboring these shoulds inside that we often don't even realize, these beliefs about how people should be. But actually, nobody responds well to being shoulded on,
mm.
right? And so we need to actually change our perspective internally. That's much better than just trying to change your words, right? Just changing the words is going to come off as artificial, disingenuous.
Yeah,
But if you
yeah,
can
yeah.
actually change your perspective and realize, oh, I may not like how someone behaves in their habits and their patterns, but they do have the right to be as they are. And I want to express how their actions impact me in a way that takes responsibility for my inner state, instead of just engaging in the blame game, which humans have tried for thousands of years now, and it's never gone well. So a different sort of strategy is called for.
I think you should be some kind of diplomat. It would work really well. I'm sure. I'm sure you have your own arguments, but I mean, I'd like to.
Sure.
I'd like to have you on my side with an argument with my wife. But it's a great it's a great chapter, a really good chapter, actually, and a very practical one in terms of general relationship guidance. It does sound though like, I mean, people will say from there, well, if there's no right or wrong, or people acting should, or in any way that they ought to act, then you're just engaging in moral relativism, that anything goes then. Which I know is not what you're saying either. So how do you get out of that one?
Yeah, that if we admit that well-being is better than misery, which I think we should, if we admit that as a moral truth, then we escape this moral relativism. We say, okay, well, some actions foster well-being for myself and others more than other actions, and I want to pay attention to that, because if I foster well-being, I'm going to also have better relationships. I'm going to have a lot of appreciation from others. I'm going to enjoy my connections with humans more and more if I keep focusing on what brings the maximum well-being for myself and others. But at the same time, we have to admit that any moral truth that we discern is not embedded in nature itself, right? We know nature's not fair. We know that the cute innocent big-eyed animals get eaten by the animals with bigger teeth, and so that's just to say that if we think that our moral truths are embedded in nature, then we
Mm.
feel justified in imposing them on other people. And if somebody doesn't want to admit that well-being is better than misery, and guide their actions by it, we can't say, "Well, you should be different from how you are." All we can do is simply step away from them. Is to not engage with those people. And so those people find a new motivation for changing their behavior in noticing that nobody wants to engage with them, right? And for this, we have to be willing to be impolite in a way, right? Because oftentimes we are polite even to those who don't exhibit any evidence that they give a shit about anyone's well-being. And I think we need to be more honest with those people, and not pretend we're okay with their behavior.
Mm.
So there's a truth there about, are you actually okay with someone's behavior or not, that's different from the should. You see, the should is a belief about how things ought to be, that people then
Yeah.
weaponize
Mm.
and
Or essentially
use.
are. Yeah, that it's a law of
But
nature, which is certainly
right, but
not.
the
Yeah.
but the visceral thing of
Mm.
like, I feel profoundly uncomfortable with the way you're acting. That is a truth that deserves to be articulated, and it can be separated then from the should, right? From the should that we beat people over the head with. Here's how you should be. And it's just that honesty, and it's actually more vulnerable in a way, but that vulnerability is our strength. Having the ability to say, "Wow, I feel really uncomfortable about what you just said, or how you're behaving," rather than "You're a jerk," you know,
Mm.
"You're not spiritual. You call yourself a yogi," or whatever, you
Mm.
know.
Mm. Mm. Excellent. I mean, moving on from there, a slight
Mm.
segue. The chapter on "Be Your Best Self," which kind of suggests that there's a better to get to, that we're trying to aspire to, you know, something more spiritual. And you mentioned the self-help industry perpetuating a story. The purpose of human life is psychological and spiritual growth. So if it's not spiritual growth, what is it?
Well, in the tradition that I come from, that I participate in, um, there's a beautiful teaching that each and every being has already accomplished their purpose for being just in existing, right? Your worth is proven by your very existence, meaning to say that the purpose for the existence of a specific embodied being is to embody the aspect of the one or the divine that they do. And they already embody that aspect simply by existing. So the point here is to, if you want to make changes, is to base that endeavor on authentic self-acceptance. That if we look at ourselves and we judge ourselves, hate ourselves, find ourselves lacking, not good enough, I don't measure up, I'm not as I should be,
Mm. Mm.
that does not provide us with a sound basis for change, because true beneficial and lasting change can only happen on the basis of reality. And the reality is that you're actually fine as you are, because any notion that you're not is nothing but a thought. You are as you are. And the thought that you're not as you should be, it can't be found anywhere in reality. It's just a thought. It's just a thought based on people's pushback against this or that aspect of your personality or whatever. But they push back for reasons of their own. It's not. It doesn't constitute evidence that you're not as you should be.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
yet, we feel this natural impetus to change and grow, which is beautiful if it's based on self acceptance. Having accepted myself as I am, I feel an inspiration to grow.
Mm.
And that's part of nature,
Yeah, you
and it's
mentioned it
beautiful.
kind of form of a game. You say a form of playing. Intrinsically rewarding activity. Yeah, so,
Exactly.
so there's a sense of lightness of touch there. I mean, because as you point out in your chapter, the irony of being your best self is to say, well, essentially, myself is inadequate. Essentially, it's a disguise, as you mentioned, worn by self-hatred. Essentially, yourself is invaluable or not valuable enough, and you need to be better. So, yeah, it's definitely, definitely a near enemy of one of the closest ones, because these days it's all about progress, isn't it? And kind of being better and being
Yeah.
more. Yeah.
And that's a wonderful game to play. It's just that what most people are doing are deferring their self acceptance until they become this idealized version of themselves. But that the problem is that's like an ever retreating carrot. You can never quite reach it. You keep putting the version of yourself that you're willing to accept in the future, and it simply stays there in the future. So what I'm suggesting, and in fact have experienced, and many other people can testify to this, is that true self acceptance does not in any way negate the inspiration to grow and change. In fact, it provides the firmest foundation for the natural process of growth. Whereas if we're trying to change ourselves to match an idealized image of ourselves generated by the mind, there's an artificiality to that and even a violence to
Mm.
that, which ultimately doesn't serve us.
And I think it also generally a subterfuge to carry on pushing under or suppressing a whole bunch of things you don't want to see. Rather than
Exactly.
acceptance, it's like, well, actually, and I agree. You see things once you accept the thing, and you can actually look at it and think, well, I'm accepting it, but that's pretty noxious, like to feel or to think or to behave in that way. But you can accept it, and then you can be in it, and then only then, you can decide, well, that's actually, like not the way I want to continue. Whereas
Yeah.
the other kind of form of it is it never really comes back to the kind of owning up kind of feeling of, okay, that is me, and now I can move forward from there.
Yeah, because any behavior that when you look at it in yourself honestly, you say, "Wow, okay, that's not really a good or beneficial trait." You might even call it noxious, as you said. But then you need to look deeper and see, well, why? Why is that there? And you find usually there's some fear, right, that's underlying that's causing you to behave in that way, or there's something unresolved in your system, and what's unresolved in your system is not your fault, but it deserves some attention and some care and some resolution, right? And so you see that the basis of any so-called noxious behavior is actually something quite innocent. That there's this natural and innocent fear or something else that comes from our past unresolved experiences, and we all have those because as young people, we can't digest our experiences. We're not mature enough, so we store a portion of the pain of the experience for later. And then what happens is most people don't go back and digest that. Right? They just suppress it, and that's what turns adults into into unpleasant people. It's simply their undigested experiences, and none of those are their fault, but they are their responsibility.
Mm, mm. Yeah, and it speaks a lot to another chapter where you kind of mention the fine line between personal responsibility and accepting that that we create our reality. I think that's the name of a chapter, isn't it? You create your own reality,
Hmm.
which then has a very heavy weight on the person. Right? It's like, well, all of this is my fault. When you see, as you say, that part of the self acceptance is just seeing the individual for what it is. So it dispels that weight of, well, I am this. I created all of this. I'm feeling this like it was. some choice that you completely thought, well, I'm going to act and feel in this, or this way that's not efficacious, as you put it, or I would put it noxious, and it all weighs heavily, so you can't even feel it. But if you understanding the self as a more of a process, as many causes and conditions coming together, as you mentioned, everything is created by everything, or then
Mm.
it kind of disperses the weight of the whole sense of selfness, that you can actually own up to a lot more, as it were, seeing yourself as not inherently self-created, if I'm making any sense. Do you want to speak a little bit
Yes,
more about that? Yeah.
yes, because in fact, nothing is your fault, because the very idea of fault is flawed. The very idea of fault is a mental construct that doesn't have any strong connection to reality. So when it is in a sense true that you create your own reality, meaning to say your experience of the world and of everything moment to moment is a product of factors that have to do with your body mind and have to do with your consciousness, right? So it is true that the way you're experiencing something is largely a product of the configuration of your own psyche, and so in that way you create your own reality, but not in the sense that if something bad happens, it's somehow
Mm,
your fault, like it's karma, or it's the law of
mm, mm,
attraction, like you thought negatively and so you
mm,
attracted
mm,
negativity. That's a bunch of
mm,
nonsense, and yet we do have this responsibility to realize, oh, the way I'm experiencing something is not because someone else made me experience it that way. It's because of the way that my psyche, as it's currently configured, responds to whatever happens in the flow of events. And so by reconfiguring the psyche, we can have a very different experience. And that can either happen intentionally or it can happen spontaneously, like with spiritual awakening, where we sense, oh, what I am is actually not the psyche, it's not the mind or body, it's something much deeper. And when you sense that the beauty and intrinsic divinity of what you actually are, then amazingly, the psyche starts to spontaneously reconfigure itself in alignment with that, having received the impact, as it were, of that realization.
mm, mm. You talk a lot about digestion and digesting emotions. You've mentioned a number of times, and I really like that terminology. Maybe you can speak a bit more about that, and also maybe perhaps relate that to the chapter "Listen to Your Heart" and
Yeah.
this kind of differentiation that we have, or this obsession with is it emotional? Is yoga, for example, let's talk about yoga, our subject ostensibly here. Is yoga a feeling thing and about embodiment, or is yoga a Patanjalian kind of their attempt at enlightenment, which is taking ourselves out of the body into the realm of ideals, a Platonic kind of cerebral endeavor, and then this idea of digestion comes in, which you mentioned in the other talk with me, which I really liked, which is a kind of tantric idea. And I know your background is tantric in terms
Yeah.
of assimilation, both thought and emotion at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. I could have done another chapter in the book on the near enemy of let it go, but I ended up working those teachings into other chapters. But you hear a lot in spiritual communities, just let it go. You're feeling anger, you're feeling fear, you're feeling whatever, just let it go. And from the tantric perspective, we say, well, that's actually dead wrong, because all these emotions are part of your aliveness. They're part of your prana, part of your vitality. And so rather than trying to let them go, you want to actually digest them. Because when you digest emotions, especially if they're intense, then the emotion turns into pure aliveness. So you're experiencing this fear or anger or whatever, and if you can, to some extent, strip away the story associated with it and just experience the emotion as pure intensity, pure energy, then you find you're able to digest it. You're able to bring it all the way in, and it spontaneously converts to life energy, and you feel more alive.
Mm.
So there's more about how to do this in the book itself.
Yes, there
Uh,
is. Yeah, yeah.
but it's that's the key, is that instead of letting it go or pushing it away or renouncing it, we actually digest this emotional energy. And eventually we learn to digest our stories as well. And then we have more life energy available to us. And actually, it's slightly more complex because in the digestion process, some of the excess energy naturally flushes out. So we do end up letting go of some of that energy, but not by, you don't have to cue yourself to do that. If you just cue yourself to digest it, I can digest
Mm,
this, I can be with
mm.
this, and then allow it to digest into my core, then naturally some of it flushes out and some of it amplifies your aliveness. But again, this is only going to work if you can at least partially peel off the story that's stuck to the emotional energy.
Mm, mm. I think it's. I mean, it's a great teaching, and not often heard these days. This idea of digestion, because people are walking through life, and we never get a moment these days to take a moment and reflect. I think that's a complete, a particularly modern problem that we're having. That there just aren't pause moments these days as much.
We don't have as much
Um,
time for digestion.
yeah,
Yeah. And so
yeah.
this is a
Even when
tantric
you might have a
teaching.
cigarette break before. Now you
Yeah.
don't even you're not even allowed to smoke anymore. You used to have a cigarette, and you might digest a little bit. Having
Yeah.
that cigarette, you might also digest.
Well, that's the
Now
thing,
you just got to
actually.
look at your phone.
If somebody
Yeah,
were to
yeah.
smoke but also digest their experience, if they could actually do that, I would bet anything they would be
Be healthier,
healthier, physically even,
healthier.
than somebody who's not digesting their experience, because that undigested experience toxifies in the system, and that affects the physical body as well eventually.
Best point ever. Because I used to love smoking, so I maybe
I'm not saying you should go back.
so, and, I'll tell the doctor. He told me to. Yeah, but no, it's a great chapter. He's, you mentioned the emotion becomes intensity, neither good nor bad, and the intensity becomes aliveness, as you just said, and the aliveness can express in all kinds of wonderful ways. And this is the idea of tantra, basically, for people that aren't aware of the idea of tantra. I believe tantra comes from the etymology or the root of etymological root of tan or thread or something continuous, some continuity of experience, that all experience is allowed within the spiritual path, as it were, and not some prioritized. This is a good one, and this isn't a good one. So I mean, I don't
Yes,
know whether you
sort
want
of
to
the idea,
correct me.
everything, it's not specifically related to the etymology of the word, actually, which etymologically, tantra means an instrument for expansion.
Okay,
And it
I stand
refers to,
corrected.
yeah, well, because the root tan is to expand, and
Uh
tra
huh.
is an instrumental suffix. It's what you're referring to is the fact that the word tantra in other contexts can also mean a loom for weaving. And so people kind of grabbed onto that idea. Oh, it's like weaving together everything in your life to make a beautiful tapestry. I love that teaching, but
Is it just a folkloric?
it's a
Is it
modern
just a
idea.
folk? Oh no!
No, but it's still
I
a
fall
great.
into the old Hatha Yoga Sun Moon kind of folkloric interpretation without my knowing.
Yes,
No.
but here's the
Um,
interesting part: is like it can still be a valid teaching and a valid representation of the philosophy, even though the factual claim being made, this is the etymology, is wrong.
okay. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it is valid in the sense that Tantra does indeed seek to not reject anything, but rather to weave all of our life experiences into the beautiful tapestry of being. And so every thread, there's no thread that's rejected, right? It's rather, let's find a way to weave it in where it becomes part of the beauty of experience. So indeed, there's no such thing as negative emotions in this tradition. And indeed, I make the argument in the book that there are no emotions that are intrinsically negative because they never prompt you to harm others. No matter how angry you are, the cause of harm is believing a story. It's so and so's fault. They wronged me.
Mm,
I
mm.
they should be hurting like I'm hurting or whatever. So the anger itself is not what prompts harmful action. It's the believing a story. So the tradition is saying, as indeed other spiritual traditions also say, that ignorance is the problem. right? So in a non-dual mode, we understand the only actual problem is ignorance. It's not your emotions, it's nothing else. It's just a lack of understanding about your experience that becomes problematic, right? And engenders suffering. So people don't realize, and most people don't realize, it's actually possible to have virtually all the so-called negative emotions and not suffer.
Right.
You can experience sadness as beauty. You can experience anger as beauty. You can experience fear as aliveness, and so on. And so that's the thing, is like, we don't need to try to have a different embodied experience. We need to have a deeper understanding that translates to a deeper
Mm,
acceptance of our embodied experience, and then it can totally open this door of bliss, really, of joy and beauty, where before we saw or imagined negativity.
mm. Yeah, it reminds me of I spent quite a lot of time with Tibetan Buddhists when I was younger, and I remember one geshe saying to me, "The problem is not your emotions; it's the confusion that you're not actually feeling any one emotion properly. You're just confused with an ambiguity of all these different emotions, and never properly understanding one emotion."
Yeah,
So it had a lasting impact on me, because you always think, well, the problem is the emotion, but actually, it's not the emotion itself. The problem is the confusion that you're not actually ever properly embodying the emotion in
yeah,
in
yeah,
its clear sense.
and this is why Tantra also comments on the role of art, because with by art I mean all forms of art: movies, novels, poems, everything, right? And what's interesting is, when we go to the movies or when we read poems, we love sad ones as well as happy ones. We love the
Mm,
full range of artistic expression. We love feeling all the emotions that art can make us feel. And the reason we love it is because we're not taking it personally. So the tantric teaching is, if you cannot take your own life experiences personally, you can experience them as beautiful in the same way that you can experience a brilliantly done movie as beautiful, even though it's
mm.
also very sad in moments.
I was going to ask you about enlightenment, but I think that kind of answers the question, doesn't it? I mean, what more could one want? Like that kind of flowing experience, Because I mean, there's such a poignancy in so many, as you say, with art and with poetry. And you mentioned one of my favorite poems in your book, T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets. I
Mm,
think you referenced Little Gidding as reading these kind of things, and of course there's an incredible kind of sadness around it, but the emotion is actually beautiful if you're not somewhat ensconced or in kind of involved in your own story with it, which then turns it
exactly.
into a hell. But the pure emotion is just it's a poignancy, it's joy in a
Yeah.
way.
So the
Um,
problem is this false sense of self, that if you believe that there's this separate self that has this emotion, and you believe the emotion is negative or problematic, then you believe the self is problematic. You negatively evaluate the self, but this self is actually imagined, right? It's the assumption that the emotions belong to someone and reflect on that someone. But when we look to find that someone, we don't actually find it except as a thought. So I'm not saying there's no self. I'm saying
mm,
that what we believe to be the self is a psychological construct, and it causes us tremendous suffering, because we
mm,
attribute the thoughts and emotions we think of as problematic to this imagined self, this constructed self, which is a social psychological construct. And so, through the whole spiritual process, in a way, is dissolving that false self. And what we call true self is not a construct, and it's not separate. Also, there's no such thing ultimately as separate self. So the true self is the beingness that can't be um, articulated in language, but the pure beingness that we actually share with all beings. And this beingness is intrinsically beautiful, and everyone who experiences it can testify to that.
Mm,
And
mm,
experiencing is not really so difficult. The difficult thing is shifting the locus of identity from this psychologically constructed self to this pure beingness. That's the project of so-called enlightenment. Yeah.
mm, mm. Yeah, I mean, I think maybe along those lines, to reference a teacher I know you like, Adyashanti,
Mm.
and he's saying, well, like, it's not necessarily that different to what you might have felt already. Somewhat, perhaps it's the understanding of the experience. I mean, the enlightenment isn't somewhere up here that like you're going to have some crazy kind of ping moments. It's actually perhaps it's more down here in the present. It's just a question of understanding more clearly the experience that we're already having, and some of those moments, even when you talk about beingness, I think everyone's had the moments of beingness. It's just somewhat they haven't kind of consolidated to the degree that perhaps they could do. So I suppose it's a certain way to say, like, how does one then use this teaching in daily life? And I'd like then to ask you, as I know I haven't got long with you, to ask you a little bit about your chapter, I Am My Own Guru. And how, and yes, well, in particularly this time and this week we've had with certain figures and social media and gurus. To not mention any names, I mean, it seems opposites that the worry about being taught, and receiving instruction on how to do which are difficult and somewhat risky things, is real. And how do we relate to a teacher these days in the modern idiom? It's not the same way as we may have originally when these texts were authored in the geographical landmass we call India, related to a teacher.
Yeah. Well, this is there's an argument here that it has more depth than we have time to get into, but essentially in the book I'm arguing that we absolutely need teachers on the spiritual path because to use a metaphor, you can't draw a map to a place you've never been. So the teacher is offering you a map, and of course you have a problem here, which is that the teacher has to have been or has to reside, in fact, where you want to go, and you can never be 100% sure because you're evaluating that from this separate self perspective, this dualistic perspective, and yet you have to rely on your own intuition and say, well, it seems like this person is speaking from the place I would like to reside in, so I'm going to listen to them. And you really have no other option unless you just want to trust to luck, which some people call luck grace. But still, if you want to actually do something to make this paradigm shift that I think we shouldn't call enlightenment because that pedestalizes it too much. But this paradigm
Mm,
shift is really possible for any human being who's sufficiently interested in it. And we do need pointers from those who've already had the paradigm shift. And so you have to just trust someone, listen to someone, and if after a while you feel like, you know what, I'm not sure that this person is genuinely speaking from that place, fine, then look for someone else, and then listen to them, because in that process, guided by your own intuition, nobody else's,
mm, mm,
you keep deepening because as your sense of what you're feeling into gets deeper, your sense of who's worth listening to gets more accurate over time, right? So it's a process that works. And then what can happen, right, is this paradigm shift, which it's very, very hard to explain because, on the one hand, it's deeply familiar, like you're touching into something that you knew even as a little child and forgot. But on the other hand, it's not familiar. On the other hand, it's astonishingly different because to see the world from the perspective of pure beingness instead of from the perspective of the conditioned mind is extremely different. It's an extremely different experience. even though it also has this element of familiarity. So just when you're touching into it a little bit, you experience more of the familiarity.
Mm,
Oh,
mm,
this is like the innocence and wonder of a child. I remember this, you know. But as you go deeper into it, there's this really profound paradigm shift where you're no longer looking to the mind um, to find the truth about anything, because you've realized that the mind only produces mental representations of reality. It never produces reality. So you have to learn to see without the mental filters. And when the filters fall away and substantially, as opposed to just a glimpse, then that's when the paradigm shift is like, whoa, it's mind blowing. You know, it can be utterly mind blowing because you're not who you thought you were, but also nothing is what you thought it was,
mm,
because nothing is reducible to your concept of it. And so you end up in this blown open space, this wide open space where you're no longer even an individual. There's no words for the realization of what you are, and this is ultimately what yoga is all about. You know, in any of its versions, we can talk about this version and that version and how Patanjali is different from Tantra, but they at least agree on this,
mm,
right?
mm,
That
mm.
realizing your true nature as divine consciousness, just to put a label on it, no label works, but that's one we can put there. To realize that true nature is the goal of the path. Not only realize it, but be it, live from it. And that's where the different branches of the tradition can agree.
So Jesus said, "Be like children." Really, that's a bit of a near enemy, really, isn't
Yes,
it?
yes, yes.
They're
Be
like
like
children, but not
children in
actually a
some
child.
way.
Yeah, yes, yeah, yeah. No, I had to say that. But on a on a more serious note, I mean, you only say that one of the last chapters in your book is all paths lead to the same goals. Now, now for what you just said, I know it sounds like you're saying that, but you're not, because in this chapter you very much say that you need to have an aim and need to suit your method towards that aim. And when you do that, yeah, I think you make some quite serious claims about how the efficacy of your progress, along that path will increase, exponentially.
Yeah,
Once you've got clear what you're aiming for and suited your method appropriately. Now, I mean, could definitely, that's one of my bugbears in the yoga world, is that people really aren't clear what they're practicing for, or they've got some ideas of Patanjali in their back pocket, about some kind of chitta vritti narodaha, but yet they're practicing, asana for quite a while a day, and also looking to feel and looking to experience in asana and in the world. So yeah, maybe you could just wrap up a conversation. We talk a little bit about that, and how to that
yeah,
maybe all paths don't lead to the same goal.
yeah. Certainly not, right? Because there's many religions and even what we call spiritual paths that have a goal, an explicit goal of an enjoyable after death state, a heavenly after death state instead of a hellish one. That's the goal of that religion. And
Mm,
there's branches of Buddhism that teach
yeah.
this just as much as Christianity. So it's not just an East versus West thing. Um, so, the yoga tradition is not, of course, a religion, and it does have the branches of the tradition do embrace different versions of the goal, even though there's something in common, which is this thing I mentioned of realizing our innate divinity. But the thing you're touching on there about its alignment of view or philosophy with practice and with result. So we need to align those three things: our view, our
Mm,
practice, and the result we're going for. And the thing is, people, when they go to articulate the goal of practice, they often end up um, regurgitating something they've heard about what the goal should be. And the first thing to do is to be as honest as humanly possible about what your goal actually is, and no waffling about, yes, we're not supposed to have a goal in yoga, we're just practicing for the sake of it. And the thing
Yeah,
is, if you are
absolutely.
actually practicing for the sake of it, then you are already enlightened. And I doubt that's that's the case, right? So if the practice itself is the purest joy imaginable, then you don't need a spiritual path, okay?
Mm, mm,
But
mm,
if you sense, there's a deeper experience possible than I'm having as of now,
mm,
there's a more blissful, more expansive
mm,
experience possible, then you're practicing for that. But then you need to define it in terms that make sense to you, that are really real for you. And then once you've defined what you're practicing for, where you're aiming the practice, then you need to look at, does the practice I'm doing actually lead to that goal, or is it likely to lead to that goal? And that's where we need to consult with teachers as well. And we say to our teachers, hey, well, this is my goal, and this is my practice. Do you think I'm missing something in the practice that might help me reach the
mm,
goal? Right. And if the teacher has any real understanding of what you're talking about, and you say, oh, my goal is to have access to unconditioned joy, and the full expansiveness of being, and my practice is an hour and a half of physical asana a day and 10 minutes of pranayama, then the
mm,
teacher, again, if they know anything at all, will say, no, that practice is not going to lead to that goal. It's not going to actualize as that goal. You're going to need to add in some other elements, such as, well, the problem is, what do we call it? Because as soon as I say meditation, people think, oh, that means stilling your mind, quieting the mind,
mm,
focusing
mm,
on one thing. But no, uh, I would use other terms, actually, like communion with reality, sitting in openness and being with what is, not your story about what is, but being with what is as fully as possible. That practice is indispensable if you want to actualize the more spiritual goals of yoga.
Where, I mean, can I just ask where this current idea of meditation came in? Does it have a
Yeah.
place where we
Yeah.
pulled it from, or is it really a modern
No,
fabrication?
it comes simply from a misunderstanding of Patanjali, a misunderstanding
Right.
of that sutra you cited, number 1.2, which people translate as, oh, yoga is stilling or stopping the fluctuations of the mind, right? But I argue it's been mistranslated by most people, not all. And the real
Mm,
translation, if you look in the commentaries and look deeper into the text, the correct translation is, yoga is the state in which the churning of the mind has become still. And notice it's not then a verbs telling you what to do, still your mind. That
mm,
yoga is the result of practice in that sutra. It's not the practice, it's the result of
mm.
practice. And so
Yeah,
that's the
yeah.
fundamental misunderstanding. If you practice, then you achieve the state of yoga, which is a state in which the churnings of the mind have settled, have become still of their own accord, spontaneously as a result of the practice. So the misunderstanding that comes from that mistranslation, yoga is stilling the fluctuations of mind. I've got to still them. And
Mm.
that's not what Patanjali was actually saying. And it's not what anyone would say if they really have deep experience in this, because you don't get anywhere by trying to make your mind still. You want to create the conditions in which the mind naturally settles down and eventually does drop into profound stillness of its own accord.
When they're talking in the say in the Bhagavad Gita then about meditation, I mean, there seems to be talking about sit. There's a certain chapter, I think chapter 6, sit with your spine straight and you're breathing in and out regularly on a seat of deer skin, and kusha grass. What are they doing there? I mean, what I'm trying to get at, I suppose, is this current idea of meditation as particularly vipassana or shamatha meditation. Stilling them, focusing the mind on one point. Is that really ancient, or is that
Yes, it
something
is. It
that's
is. But what Tantra argues, and I think this argument can be shown to be true, is, but the Tantric tradition says all of that is valid, but it is preparatory exercises. That the concentration on one point or one thing is a preparatory exercise, because what the deeper practice is learning to be with reality without the mental filters, to have radical clarity and communion with reality. Again, this is the tantric view. And for that, you first must learn to concentrate, because if you go to just try to be with reality without any mental training, what'll happen is you're just going to be with the churnings of the mind, you know? And so the mind imposes itself in the center of experience way too strongly for most people until they've done some mind training. So that's the sort of Jedi aspect of the path. You need to do this mind training that, and so, but here's the thing, you're not trying to make the mind be still. You're just uh, cultivating concentration and focus in a relaxed way, not in a striving way, because striving reinforces the sense of doership and the separate self.
Mm,
So you've got to focus in a relaxed way. And then as you do that, then when you release the focus and open up to the total context, you find you're able to be with the total context much more fully subsequent to that concentration exercise. And so, from the tantric point of view, if you're just doing these meditations where you focus on the breath or whatever,
mm, mm,
and not going on to the next stage, you're, in a sense, making the meal and not eating it, right? So these are preparatory exercises that are good, but the deeper teaching is missing. And it's not to say that the Bhagavad Gita, was wrong, because the tantric tradition argues that this deeper teaching is supposed to be given orally, not in a
mm,
text, because the
mm,
because you need coaching in real time from a real human who's done it. In a way that a text can't convey so well. So they would say, the tantrikas would say, oh, Bhagavad Gita is perfectly good, but the deeper stage is not given there.
mm. It does seem to suggest, though, that we're looking for in the Bhagavad Gita an emotionalist state. That someone, where they say, kind of, to that person who's reached that state, a lump of gold or a piece of shit are equal.
Yes.
Everything is equal. There's no interest in anything. Almost, it's a dispassionless state.
Yes.
It's hard to argue the Gita it could be anything to do with a tantric text, right? It seems
It's
to
not a tantric text,
no.
yet it received a tantric interpretation
Did
where
it?
they said, okay, let's look at this
Right.
in another
Interesting.
way.
Yeah.
So for example, the Gita says, one of the things it says is yoga is equanimity, samatvam.
Hmm.
And so people imagine that means being very unruffleable, very steady, almost emotionless,
Hmm.
even keeled. Um, and the tantric tradition says, well, no, what this really means is that you have access to the equanimity of your true nature, even as your body mind is sometimes in turmoil, right? So the equanimity in question is not flattening out the mind, it's having access to the profound okayness of your real being, even when your mind is freaking out.
Hmm.
And so Tantra says that's the real equanimity there, even if it might be the case that the Bhagavad Gita originally did have in mind a kind of emotional flattening out, right? So there's this very brilliant reinterpretation, which I think is in service to a deeper truth. And with the lump of gold and piece of shit or
Hmm.
whatever, it's
Didn't actually
that
say that.
in the tantric
Yeah.
interpretation, it's not because you've renounced everything so completely that you're equally dispassionate towards both. It's rather that you see that everything is a manifestation of the one consciousness, and the gold and the piece of shit are equally a manifestation of the one consciousness, that the one becomes all this, and that itself is fascinating and beautiful. And so we're not caught up in the mind's preferential picking and choosing as much, even though we still have preferences. The preferences aren't as important when you're experiencing that all phenomena are equally an expression of the one. And so that's the way they would interpret that. So this is the inclusive nature of the
Mm.
tantric tradition. Is it will reject and negate some things like Patanjali's dualism, but in general, it tries to include as much as possible from the earlier tradition and just
Yeah. Mm.
reinterpret it.
Do you have a particular text in mind for that interpretation of the Gita? I know people are going to ask, oh, ask him about which text it is. So before I have to bother you with that,
Yeah, yeah.
say it now.
Abhinavagupta wrote a commentary on the Gita, giving it a tantric interpretation, and that's called the Gita Sangraharta. No, I'm forgetting the title now. Gita Sangraha. No, Gitartha Sangraha. That's right. But anyway,
Excellent. Okay.
so that has been translated, but not as well as I would like. But we can put a link to that if somebody's interested in.
Yeah,
But it's a decent.
absolutely.
I don't
Yeah.
want to say it's bad. It's a
Right.
decent translation. But
Well, there's a bit more work for you to do anyway. You haven't
yes.
got enough. Retranslate that tantric text. Okay.
But
Well,
last thing on that,
sorry.
rather than
Yeah.
looking for this or that book, the
Yeah.
tantric tradition says, find a good teacher, and they can share with you these beautiful reinterpretations, because oftentimes the books, unless they're translated brilliantly, they can be quite dry or incomprehensible. So we're as a spiritual culture, we're a bit too book focused, I say
Hmm.
ironically.
Hmm.
Right? But discovering a book that you love really should channel you towards the teacher who wrote the book, because it's in these dialogues, in this engagement, that the spiritual path unfolds more efficiently. Because if we read the books, we end up often being kind of armchair spiritualists, and we feel good about the contemplations we're having, but they don't have the same impact on our daily lives.
Yeah, and we can certainly say that you've got enough stuff on YouTube as well. If you want to check Christopher out on YouTube, there's loads and loads of very generous chats on all things Tantra on YouTube as well. So you can check him out after reading the book. And the book's got loads. I mean, I wanted to ask you about loads of other chapters. I might just ask you about one more thing. But, other titles such as You Can Choose How You Respond. That's a really good chapter. Create Your Own Reality. We've talked about a little bit. Finding Your Soul's Purpose is very interesting. I mean, many people today suggest that everyone has their dharma, which of course we all do have our dharma, but that we have to actualize something into a kind of, I've become a, so-and-so movie star or yoga teacher or whatever, maybe you might talk about that. I was thinking, well, how can we close this? There's a huge burden these days on becoming something, and I did interview someone who wrote a book on finding your dharma, like everyone has their particular thing, that their particular groove. And I know my wife is always worried about this. I don't have a thing, she says, you have a thing, I don't have a thing. And I say, well, you don't need a thing, you are what you are, like, so how would you answer that question?
Yes, I think the notion of and this is again not just my opinion. I'm basing this on the traditional teachings.
Mm,
The
mm,
notion
yeah.
of finding your dharma is really profoundly misconstrued, and it's not
Mm,
a phrase that you ever would find in any of our primary sources. As if there's some kind of mission or purpose written in the stars, or given by God, that you're supposed to
mm,
discover. This is, I think, not only wrong thinking, but harmful thinking, because then you end up with this suffering of, oh, I haven't found my purpose. What is my purpose? And your fundamental purpose, as I said, is simply to exist, not only as you are now, but from the deepest fullness of your being, right? That's the only purpose that we have, to be, but to
mm,
be more completely, to exist from
mm,
the deepest fullness of our being. That can be the only purpose, and it's the same for each of us. And yet there is this thing, dharma, and dharma really, here, we're talking about the concept of swadharma, right? My
mm,
own dharma. And people again misconstrue that to be like my life mission, or something
mm,
like that, but it really just means responding appropriately to what arises on your life journey. And by appropriate, I don't mean some sort of judgmental attitude, but by actually engaging with what arises on your life's
Mm.
journey, instead of pursuing some imagined ideal. So this is indeed the problem, is that people are constantly prioritizing their mental image of a possible reality over reality itself, which is perfectly insane. Right? So following your dharma is nothing more than engaging with what actually arises on the journey of your life and seeing where it leads you. And of course, there is some choice involved there, because different things arise and you feel inspired to go more towards this thing that's arisen in your life than that thing. But you're still organically responding to what is arising, rather than, you know, doing this thing that the American culture has enshrined as a great thing, dreaming. Right?
Mm.
Dreaming is a romantic term for imagining and giving more weight, priority, and significance to your imagination, your mental image of a possible reality, than to reality itself. And what the this tradition says is your deepest happiness is going to come actually from engaging in the aspects of reality that are most interesting and most inspiring to you, and seeing where they lead. And you just keep doing that. It's following the golden thread in your life. And so what the beauty that is in inside of you, and there is beauty in each of us whether we find it or not, it can
Mhm.
express more fully through this organic engagement with what's arising in life, and not worrying about where is it leading me, and not giving too much importance to these mental images, but trusting that there's an organic unfolding to life, and
Mm.
that simply giving energy to what is most inspiring to you, that's actually happening
Mm.
uh, in your real life,
Yeah.
that is your dharma. And you know, and that's the thing. You have to relinquish this idea of being a something that somebody can point to and say, so
Yeah.
for
Seeing
example,
yourself through someone else's eyes, basically,
exactly,
rather than, yeah, yeah,
exactly. So your wife
valuing your
could
own
experience
experience. Yeah.
profound fulfillment
Yeah.
without
That's what I tell her.
ever embodying a role that someone could point to and say, oh, that's what she is, because that's just a mental construct, you know? So you don't need a thing, but you do need to keep pursuing that which is most inspiring to you, of all the things arising within your sphere.
Yeah. Well, I always tell her you don't want to be a yoga teacher anyway. Pick something else.
It's overrated.
But no, I mean, yeah, yeah, exactly. And it's been such a wonderful chat with you, Christopher. It's been a long time since I found someone so interesting as Christopher Hareesh. So, I thank you, and I hope that our guests will enjoy your presence and all the stuff that you share as much as I have and do. Yeah, and the book is wonderful. So please go out and check out Near Enemies of the Truth. Totally recommend it. And yeah, all links in the notes below. Thank you for your time, Christopher. It's so much appreciated. Thanks for coming on again.
Thank you. It's wonderful to talk, and yeah, maybe we could do this, a couple times a year going forward, or whatever you think. But it's just so enjoyable to chat with you.
Will be an honor. Thank you.